back, everyone, to another episode of the Warriors in Business podcast. We have another great guest joining us today. We are very excited to speak with him and pick his brain for your enjoyment and for your education to hear from your fellow peers. So thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Warriors in Business podcast. Please subscribe and share with your friends and family on the various podcast channels that you listen to for this, which right now we have it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and on YouTube as well, including some short clips from the previous interviews that we've done before. So we would very much appreciate and love your support for our show as we grow this channel and spread the word for the mission that we are on to elevate and promote military, veteran, and first responder-owned businesses. So today we are talking with Paul Pantani. Paul is the host of the Transition Drill podcast. He is also a law enforcement leader with 30 plus years of law enforcement experience. And he is also an adjunct professor at the university level for 10 years. And so with that awesome background, we are delighted to have Paul on the show today. Paul, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Yourself?
I'm doing great here. All's well. And I had mentioned it to you right before the show started, but normally we are joined by my co-host, Todd. Todd is feeling under the weather today. He's got a cold and his voice isn't quite podcast ready. So we wish him well on feeling better. So it'll just be Paul and I today, and we're going to have a great show ahead of us.
Hopefully the two of us can carry the load.
Oh, I feel like we can. We'll join arms and make it happen. So it'll be a good time. Well, Paul, thank you again for joining us. And as well, I would personally like to say thank you for your service as a first responder and for serving our local communities and our nation in that way. So I just want to first and foremost say thank you for that.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, why don't you kick us off, man? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on, what you're doing, and a little bit of what you're into nowadays.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm in law enforcement. I'm in my 31st year as a sworn police officer. I've actually crossed over my 35th year total law enforcement. Basically, in high school, I'll loosely call myself a knucklehead, as much of a knucklehead as I was, for whatever reason, I knew I wanted to be a police officer. And so right out of high school, I contemplated the military, didn't go that route. There's always that little bit in the back of my head that regrets not giving that path at least a short try for an enlistment.
Yeah.
But 6 months out of high school, I was working for a police department as a civilian employee, and I've never looked back since. And all of my time as a police officer or in law enforcement has been in California. And I currently work for a district attorney's office. And for those who are not familiar with it, at least in California, a DA's office, Bureau of Investigation, is, for no better way to describe it, a glorified detective bureau. The only thing that we don't have, as opposed to what would be deemed a traditional law enforcement agency, is a front-facing patrol function. So we don't have our investigators driving around in black and whites and handling those initial calls for service, but we do everything else. So I started my career at a local police department, did 16 years there, and then I transferred over to the DA's office 15 years ago.
Awesome. So from knucklehead to police department, that's quite a journey there, right?
It's a journey, and surprisingly enough, you don't realize how many friends you lose when you decide to go towards the first responder community, especially when you were hanging out with a group that wasn't the most. We never got to the point of actually doing anything that would have significantly ended us up in jail, but it was definitely a group that was not pro law enforcement, put it that way.
Gotcha. That's interesting for having a friend that would go on to do something great and wonderful for the community, for that to be one of the reasons why they would actually say, no, we don't want to be friends with you anymore, is because, well, you may be the one who ends up catching us in the things that we are planning on doing one day.
The unfortunate thing is that we all make decisions in our life based on the level of our experience and training. And unfortunately, when you're 18 years old, you lack in my opinion, the true life experience and maturity to make those true long-term decisions. And so, unfortunately, people come in and out of our lives, and I have no regrets. I look back at my career and I've loved every minute of it. As you mentioned at the start, I am a leader, so I've promoted up to the point of I'm currently a commander, which, depending on the organization you look at, it could be equal to a captain in a smaller agency or a bigger agency, maybe a lieutenant. And so I've had zero regrets.
Well, that's good to hear. At least over the long haul with that, and it sounds like you have um, put in a ton of work and a ton of. Obviously, you said you're coming up on 31 years
I'm
so
in my
far.
31st. I'm in my 31st year. I'm actually starting to consider my transition from this into my next career.
Oh wow! All right, yeah, and you know what? That transitions, to use this word over and over again. We'll probably play a drinking game to it at some point. To transition from what you're doing now to what you want to end up doing in the next part of your career. Not only you just mentioned for yourself, but you also have a podcast called the Transition Drill Podcast. So, why don't you talk to us a little bit more about that?
So in 2021, and I'll credit my chief at the time with coming up with the basic idea of wanting to create a network of our retirees within our organization that could be a source of reference for other members who are coming towards their retirement as a sounding board and a kind of, not necessarily mentors, but just people who they could reach out to for advice on making that transition away from law enforcement.
Right.
And so that's the absolute essence of where it came from. Then once I crossed that bridge and said, okay, I really want to think about doing a podcast, then it became, all right, I know I want to focus on the first responder community, but quickly realized that I needed to focus on the first responder and the military community, because the one thing that we both share is they do a great job of luring us or recruiting us in and showing all the cool things that you'll be able to do in your career. But there's very little as far as the transition out. Pretty much when you come to the end of your ride, it's there's the door, good luck in what you choose to do afterwards. And so I knew I wanted to focus on that. And then what even drove it further was, for many of us in these careers, we don't make it to quote unquote retirement for a variety of reasons. A very big one is injuries. And so what drove it home of the importance of starting to think today about what you're going to do tomorrow is tomorrow could literally be tomorrow. And so you need to be thinking today, what might I want to do if for whatever reason I can't do this job tomorrow? And so that's where it just kind of kept building and building. And then tying into that, the importance of when you get to your transition, maybe you want to be that person that just plays golf for the rest of your days and hangs out with your grandchildren. The equal component to that is when you get there, be in the best headspace and physical space you can.
Mm.
And so we all have heard about the numbers of suicides that have increased over the last few years. And I really wanted to focus on the importance of, yes, start thinking about what you want to do tomorrow, but equally think about and take care of yourself today. Take care of the mental aspects, because there's a lot of emotional and mental trauma that comes with these jobs, and take care of the physical aspect. Keep your physical health today as best as possible so that you can enjoy your transition. And so that's where the two avenues that I decided to go into with the podcast. And it's an interview based podcast where I interview guests who have either transitioned out from one of those two careers, or I've even had guests that maybe have a peripheral connection to the first responder community or the military community, but they're giving back in some fashion, whether it be a life coach, whether it be a psychologist, So it's kind of all that in a nutshell, but it boils down to two aspects. Start planning what you're going to do when you transition out, and take care of yourself today so that when you get to your transition, you're the best, and I put this in air quotes, you can be.
Yeah. Yeah, I love hearing all that. And what particularly sticks out from what you said is it's not just simply the plan of, okay, what am I going to do when I transition from military and or first responder to civilian life, to either a W-2 job or becoming an entrepreneur, but also taking care of self mentally and physically. Like, that aspect is just as crucial for the process as it is to have the plan on paper and to think ahead of what you're going to do. Um, and so it seems like you found that missing gap or missing link, and you're seeking to fill it right now.
I really hope so. I know that some people have said that, oh yeah, yeah, just common sense, but I really don't. I don't think it's as much common sense. If it was, there wouldn't be the need to talk about it more. Obviously, I'm 30 years into this job. I definitely grew up in an era where, especially the mental health component, the emotional health component, was never stressed. It was very much bottle it up, hold it inside, move on to the next whatever assignment is, and just take care of business. And we have to remember at the end of the day is that there is trauma. I've had numerous guests who have already told me their stories, but the one thing that jumps out is a veteran deploys, goes overseas, and they see horrendous stuff. But fortunately for them, for the most part, when they come home, there isn't the daily reminder of what they saw over there. But you flip that around to the first responder community, and say you're a firefighter and you went to a horrific traffic accident where a young child died at an intersection of walk and don't walk. Well, the likelihood is you're going to go through that intersection every single day for the rest of your career.
Mm,
And whether or not you realize it, that you are being re-traumatized, even if it's subconsciously. The other component that applies to both sides, both veteran community and the first responder community, is we tend to isolate our families and we don't talk about what we experience and what we see when we're at work or when we're deployed. And so you already kind of build in an unhealthy gap, because I can speak for myself, and I'm sure any of your other listeners can relate to this who are in the first responder world. You come home
yeah,
from work, hey, how was your day? Oh, it was fine, and we just don't talk about it. So
yeah,
there's so much that gets wrapped up in treating and taking care of your mental health, that I just want to remove the stigma that if you raise your hand and say, you know what, it's not sitting well with me, I need to talk to somebody, that there's nothing wrong with that. That we get rid of this stigma that if you ask for help, it means you're a failure or it means you're weak. No, it just means that you're human. Take advantage of what you have available to you and make sure you're keeping yourself in the best peak condition you can be.
yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Paul, that's fascinating. I hadn't quite connected those dots of what you mentioned of, someone who went on deployment, across the seas, across the world, and then returning back. I mean, obviously they're dealing with some very real, you know, tragic experiences, that they saw, while they were deployed. And so those are obviously very real problems they're dealing with. But what you just mentioned for first responders, like they live in those communities, they
Yes.
live in those neighborhoods, and they're crossing those sidewalks and those things where everyone else walking about or going about their day just sees everything as everything hunky dory. But late last night, that police officer, that firefighter, saw something absolutely tragic happen right there, and it looks normal the next day, but the night before it was absolute chaos. And so that's a fascinating thing. I hadn't quite connected those dots for that. Um, but you're
I'm not gonna take credit for that. I heard that from somebody, and it stuck with me so much that it was a stark reminder that we forget about. You know, you bring up a good point. Say you're a police officer and you're working night shift. You get off your shift, or whatever call it was, a fight, a baby not breathing,
right.
whatever. But you go through that intersection a day later, 10 hours later, whatever, with your whole family. Do you turn to your family and go, hey guys, do you know what happened right here 10 hours ago with daddy? We don't. We just internalize it and we keep it to ourselves. And I'm not sitting here saying that you need to, blast your family with all the details, because then
Right.
there's the flip side to that of vicarious trauma by exposing your family to it through the stories. But you've
Yeah.
got to find a way to unload it as opposed to carrying it inside of you. And maybe it's go talking to a professional. Maybe it's pulling your spouse aside and going, hey, here's what I experienced. I'm sorry, but I just need to give you some of the details so that I can get it out from inside of me.
Yeah. So you're just saying, but through some means, whether it's through, talking to your spouse or talking to a professional, maybe to other friends that are their fellow peers who serve with them, there needs to be a means, an outlet of some sort, is what you're saying.
100%. You need to talk to people. And I know that there's that fine line between staying insulated with everybody who is like-minded or like you. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't want to say that I'm saying don't do that, but what I am saying is that instead of just finding yourself insulated with other veterans or other first responders, force yourself into other situations where you have to interact with people who don't know what that job's about so that you can quote unquote be a little normal. Um,
Yeah.
I think unfortunately with both sides of this fence, there are many of us who make the career, the uniform, the badge, our entire identity. And that's part of the problem because when tomorrow comes and you don't have this as your identity, you're lost. You've kind of lost your mission. And then if you compound it by not having addressed the mental health component, that's where you really start seeing people deteriorate or fall off that proverbial cliff rapidly.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. And so, and I think it's great that you mentioned that, for being able to have those conversations with those that are, for lack of a better phrase, in the civilian world, whether that's just, friends in the neighborhood or even one's own spouse. Paul, what would you recommend, some advice that you would give to, like, to our listeners right now who are active first responders, or, have just, or seeking to transition to civilian life? How would you advise them for having those types of conversations? What are some things to keep in mind? What are some things not to say? What are, things like that? What would you say on those types of things?
For me personally, I would say embrace the fact that it's just a job. It is simply what we receive our paycheck for. And I'll use the analogy that I tell people: when you go to a family function or when you go to a friend's birthday party, and let's say there's somebody else in the group who's a plumber or maybe an auto mechanic or whatever, rarely do you hear the conversations around the stopped up toilet that they had to deal with that day. But inevitably, there's always the stories of, well, he's the police officer, so let's get stories from him. And I'm not saying to walk away from that aspect of it.
Yeah.
You do need to embrace the job that you do, but understand that not everybody is, I'll use my term that I referred to when we started the interview. Not everybody's a knucklehead. And I know that it's real easy to kind of get into this mentality that everybody outside of your circle is a knucklehead and you don't want to take time to deal with them.
Yeah.
Be open to talking to people. Somebody may not understand what you do. Talk to them, discuss with them what you do, not in the sense of like, oh, I need to convince you that we're right and you're wrong, because every story has two sides to it.
Yeah.
So that would be my first thing is don't insulate yourself with just other members of your community. Don't move away from them. Don't alienate them. Embrace that community that you're in, but also embrace being around civilians or what would be the normal public. The
Right.
other thing is you have to sit down, and I've now, multiple divorces, so I'm hard to say that I know what I'm doing correctly. The one thing I have realized, though, in my most current marriage is just be open. You don't have to give all the details, but be okay with saying, honey, this is what I experienced today. I need to at least just kind of tell you what I experienced. I may not give you the intricate details, but I need to talk about it. If
Yeah.
that's not going
Yeah.
to work, then at the bare bones minimum, most agencies today have adopted peer support networks. Most agencies today, whether it be through your county or through your city, have employee assistance services. Reach out and start talking to a counselor. Even what I would say is, and I've heard this from several people, they were hesitant to go talk to a psychologist because they didn't know what the conversations were going to entail. But They just walked in the door with an open mind and let the psychologist lead the conversation. And you'd be surprised how much we're trying to hide or hold in, that just with the right questions can get it out. It may be a difficult process to start, but if you make it a normal pattern for yourself, you'll definitely get more out of it, in the sense that it'll become more normal just
Yeah.
to talk about what you've experienced. So
Yeah.
those would be my three things: is just avoid the insulation, have friends and social networks that are outside of your community. Two, you've got to engage your spouse. And it may be something where you just sit down and ask your spouse, what would you like to hear from me when I come home, each day? What helps you to understand what I'm doing without traumatizing you? And then three, start going down that path. I mean, if you find yourself that you're struggling sleeping, if you're increasing the amount of alcohol, or what I've in some of my guests find is more and more of them start to isolate even more. So even when they're within their community, there's less people that they want to talk to. If you're starting to experience those things, I would strongly recommend go talk to a professional.
Paul, that was some great stuff. I do want to ask you as well about, still staying on this similar topic, for at least for what you're doing with Transition Drill Podcast. We've talked about the mental aspect and mental side of things, but let's move on to I guess the career side of things, as it were. So, because there's a lot of those that are serving in the military or as first responders, and from the conversations that I've had, many conversations I've had with them, that they are all all up in that world of military or being a first responder, and that's all they think about: live, breathe, eat, sleep, everything. And then they get to this point where they're like, all right, what do I do afterwards? Because there's structure in the military and being a first responder, and then they get out in the real world and there's like, what do I do now? Because there was these things that they were expecting, things that they knew what was coming, and then they get out into wanting to become an employee, or even considering running their own business, and there's no blueprint, there's no structure, there's no guide marks that say, hey, go here first and then here second. So I want you to talk to us a little bit about that, for at least some of the conversations you've had with those you've interviewed, things that you would recommend for those aspiring to either launch their own business or obviously to transition to civilian life.
I would say most important is define your new mission. The one thing that we have become ingrained in our careers, and it doesn't matter if you're in it for 4 years or if you're in it for 40 years, is we become very task oriented, very mission focused. Give me the details of the mission that I have to complete and let me go complete it. And when we get out into the civilian world and we don't have that mission, we don't have a clear guideline of where you need to get to, it's hard. I was just talking with a guest and he hit the nail on the head. You spend 20 years in these communities. One of the things that is not embraced is autonomy. You're not really given the latitude to make many of your own decisions. Whereas you step outside the door and, literally you step out Monday, and on Tuesday, if you don't want to get up and get out of bed, nobody's going to force you to. So where that ties back around to is have something in your mind that you want to do. Now, with that, where I would say to start today is start developing those networks of people who are in those types of jobs or where you think you might want to get to. Start talking to as many people as you can. Put yourself in a position where you can learn what's best for you to prepare for that position. If there's a job that you're interested in, start looking at job postings and see what the requirements are for that position. Is advanced education a requirement or a preference? If it's a requirement, then you already know, okay, I need to start going down the route of potentially an undergrad degree or a grad degree type deal.
Yeah.
Look at the job functions. How can you, in your current assignment, and this is where the emotional maturity comes in. We all want to do the fun stuff. I get it. But sometimes the mundane, tedious stuff is actually what's more important for that transition. So I'll put it in the realm of you've gotten to the level of SWAT. Okay, that's 100-mile-an-hour team. You're doing great. But did you get the opportunity to be the admin officer and keeping track of all the training records and all of the weapons logs and all of the qualifications? That admin type duty is actually going to serve you better in the civilian world than being able to cut a corner and hit your quote unquote field of fire for a room you're going into. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't have fun in your career. Of course you should. But as you start progressing through your career, think about the other aspects that are going to be marketable. The other thing is get a mentor. And it doesn't have to necessarily be somebody who's in the field you want to get into, but maybe it's just somebody who's transitioned out. They may not even need to be an official mentor. Start looking at the people that you respect who are in the job today. What did they do, or what are they doing when they transition out? And can you mirror what they're doing? Or do you say to yourself, whoa, he or she did something that I don't agree with? Whatever it is, I don't know. But we all look at other people and say, yeah, I want to do what they did, or no, I don't want to do what they did. And so by putting yourself in that situation, they become unofficial mentors because you can model yourself by what you're seeing. On the far end, though, there's nothing wrong with getting somebody who actually has made that transition, who can be your voice of reason. Hey, you want to make sure you do this. You want to make sure you do, whatever. So I would say get unofficial mentors and official mentors who can help guide you through that process. The other thing is that many of the jobs that we do in these two worlds, whether it be the veteran community or the first responder community, it's not the day-to-day stuff that they're looking for in the civilian world. Putting out a fire, arresting a suspect, engaging a threat on the battlefield.
Yeah.
What the civilian world is looking for is your ability to be assigned a task, address the task, gather the resources that are needed to complete the task, and completing the task in a timely manner. So
Yeah.
it's the day-to-day stuff in the sense of the ancillary day-to-day stuff that you need to lean into when you're making that transition out. Is how can you take the skill set that you learned while you were a first responder or in the military and transition that over to the civilian world?
Yeah. Yeah, I like the point that you mentioned for first responders that are actively serving right now, which is that you don't overlook, in a sense, the mundane, tedious tasks.
It's not the fun stuff.
It's not the fun stuff. Yeah.
But
It's the
it's
admin level stuff. It's the things that seem boring or repetitive and things like that. But that's actually, to your point of the fit of being able to do the day to day, that actually is needed, or at least an understanding of it to get by with it.
And the only other thing I would add is take advantage and take opportunities to become a leader. I know, and trust me, it took me a long time for me to cross this bridge also. You get into this mindset of, I just want to be a worker bee. Leave me alone. Let me investigate my cases. Maybe you're, a ground pounder in the military and you're like, I'm an infantry guy. Just leave me alone. Point me in the direction of the enemy and I'll get it done. But the thing that you have to remember is when you gather a breadth of knowledge and experience, you're 15 years in, you're 20 years in, if you're not sharing that with the new people coming in the door, you're doing a disservice to them and you're doing a disservice to your organization. So always look to leave the organization better than when you came in. And you do that by taking on those leadership roles. Maybe you come off the line. Maybe you aren't able to run at 100 miles an hour anymore because you're stuck in the rear with the gear. But take, what's the word I want to use? Take solace, take confidence, take some sense of pride in knowing that, hey, I'm stuck back here in the back and I'm not at the tip of the spear anymore. But man, I'm making sure that all my men and all my women have what they need so that they can keep moving forward. because
Yeah.
we can't hold on to this forever. These are jobs that time out for all of us. I don't care what you say. And you don't want to be that person who's 65 years old still, for my police types, still pushing a lead sled around. It doesn't work. You become more of a liability because you're trying to hold on to the fun that you had when you were 25 years old.
Yeah.
So move into that leadership role, take that knowledge and experience you have, and make those coming in the door better from what you can teach them.
Oh, definitely. And especially when you said for those that have served, 10, 15, 20 plus, and you're at 31 years right now, that obviously there is just the amount of experience and knowledge and wisdom that you've gained over that amount of time, that there's definitely many things to be shared with those that are upcoming in, for just joining the workforce or things like that. That for someone who may not think they could be a leader in an instance, they actually may know more than they think, or would be able to share more than they think they could in that type of way. Or at least when I
Exactly
hear
true.
of, especially when I hear of someone that has 15, 20 years experience of something, I'm like, wow, your craft, you've seen a lot, you've been through a lot for, whatever that application or that thing is, right? And I would love to hear more about it, because especially if I'm at the starting line and you're 15, 20 years down the road from where I'm at, then that's going to be, a lot of good things to talk about and to share with others who haven't quite made it that far.
And for those listening who are on the younger end of their career, you're still a leader. Imagine, even if you've got one day more than me, imagine if you could put yourself back in your shoes on day one. What would you have liked from a coworker? Would you have liked somebody to come up to you and go, "Hey, welcome. Here's the lay of the land. Here's what you don't want to do. Here's the minefield you want to avoid." Or, like we've all been in that situation, do you just want to be sitting there in the chair going, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I really hope somebody points me in the right direction." And so what
Yeah.
I get by that is every opportunity you can to help somebody along their process, do it, because you're ultimately making the organization better.
Yeah, of course. And and that just gets passed along, to the next person, then to the next person. And you've hinted at that a few times by mentioning a mentor, of seeking out a mentor, whether it's an official one or an unofficial one. And I think there's something so profound about that, where it's someone else, that is experienced, well versed, knowledgeable of, whatever that may be, to help someone else that's looking to go where that person's at, or at least, in a similar direction anyway. And especially when it's someone that's been there, done that, and can really empathize with those that are looking to transition from military and or first responder life to civilian life in that. And um so beyond the resources and things that we could read online and stuff, I think that wisdom of seeking out a mentor, because it's that human to human connection, is just so powerful and so real.
And just remember, when you're reaching out to those new connections, think of the old, you get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And what I mean by that is, all right, so we've all heard of LinkedIn, and that's the great business social media platform when you're starting to look for that job.
Yeah.
But think about how you approach it. If you find that person who's in the position that you want to get to, engage them in a manner of, "Hey, do you have a minute? I would like to learn from you," as opposed to the very impersonal, very generic message of, "Hey, I want to do the same job that you're doing. Can you point me in a direction of any companies that are hiring?" There's a little bit of psychology involved in it.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that think about how you would want somebody to approach you, and what approach to you would get you the most involved and engaged in helping them. Would you would more than likely, I'm going to assume, "Excuse me, I see that you've got a lot of experience at A, B, and C. I would love if you have a moment that I could just pick your brain on doing, what you learned from that or something." So it's that engaging and acknowledging their level of experience, but also that deference to say, "I'm not simply just reaching out for you to help me get a job. I'm hoping to learn from you."
Yeah. Yeah, it's that personal connection. It's an acknowledgement, not just of what they've done, but that you at least respect them enough, or at least on a minimal level, to politely and kindly request a moment of their time to say, hey, I would love to learn something about what you do, or at least about this thing or that thing. And so it goes from the impersonal to the personal. And
Very
so
true.
I think that's some great advice. And especially you mentioned LinkedIn, where that's on a digital screen, and whether it's laptop or on a phone, and there's millions by millions of people that utilize LinkedIn. And so you can only imagine how many messages that somebody receives in a given day, especially if they're a professional in a given industry or realm that has thousands of connections and things like that. So it needs to be a message that really reaches not just the head but the heart, and
And the
in
only
terms of and be able to learn from them.
and just while we're talking about social media, and this is just a little bit of me being on a soapbox, and definitely it's become more prominent in my brain as I've promoted up. It's very easy to live our lives on social media, but understand that everything we post on social media is going to be seen by somebody. And remember this, your social media is your business card that gets handed out to every potential employer without your control. And what I mean by that is you go to apply at job A, I guarantee you they're going to do their own research on you before you even walked in the door. And what has your social media said about you before you ever even have a chance to talk to a hiring manager or even just the initial gatekeeper? Because a lot of what I've experienced so far is many companies have just a first layer hiring personnel. And are you even going to make it past them based on what's on your social media?
Yeah.
So that's just a little bit of a soapbox of mine, but just be mindful of what you're posting on social media because it doesn't go away.
Oh, and totally understandable. Yeah, it is your digital business card, and not one that is necessarily in your control either. As you mentioned, that's brilliant, because you can make the posts that you do on the various social media platforms and put what you want to in your profile and pictures and whatever you want to talk about or do on there. But at any point, someone could just say, oh, forward this to someone else, or hey, did you see this person? And you're not even told or notified, not always. And so it's a level of responsibility and awareness that we really ought to have a lot more often in social media. I mean, it's even a good reminder for me, um, as well. So I like that you mentioned that too. As we get towards the end of our podcast here, and we've talked about a lot of great stuff today, Paul, why don't you give us the means by which people can get in touch with you, contact you if they want to learn more about your podcast and everything like that.
Well, as we've already mentioned, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm actually on all of the social media platforms under Paul Pantani. So Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. The website for my podcast is transitiondrillpodcast.com. And I'm on YouTube under the same Transition Drill Podcast, so you can watch or you can just listen to the audio recordings on any of the major social or podcasting platforms, Spotify, Apple, all of them like that. So whichever direction you want to go. And then as far as reaching out to me, you can go to the website, transitiondrillpodcast.com, and send me a message there. Or like I said, I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me through there or Instagram. So whichever way you want to do it, whichever way is most convenient for you, I'm open to connections, and I'll do as much as I can to help out.
Sounds great. Awesome. Well, yes, everyone, for everything that Paul just mentioned, we will include all of that information in the podcast description below this particular episode. And Paul, thank you so much for coming on to our show and for sharing all the incredible wisdom that you did. This has been it's been a great talk. Even I've learned from it. I did not have the privilege of serving as in the military or as a first responder. But I still have learned stuff that I can apply to my own life, even for this. So I really appreciate your time here.
My pleasure. And like I said, the one thing you'll always hear me reiterate is these are great jobs to have. I have enjoyed my 30 plus years in law enforcement immensely. I would not do it any differently. But just remember, at the end of the day, it's just a job. It pays the bills. And when you walk out the door tomorrow, don't carry that with you. Don't make that your identity. I'm a retired cop, or you're just John, you're just Mary, you're just
Yeah,
whoever. And that's what I did in the past. Embrace what you did, but don't make it your identity going forward.
solid wisdom. Yes, and thank you for leaving us with that note for that. right there. So again, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Warriors in Business podcast. We've been talking with Paul Pantani today, and thank you for listening in. Please subscribe and share the show with your friends and family. You could also go to warriorsinbusiness.com for the latest updates for this show. As well, if you are a veteran or first responder business owner, please head over to www.joinbravery.com. That's joinbravari.com to sign up for your free business listing on the Bravery online marketplace, which is specifically dedicated to promoting and elevating military, veteran, and first responder-owned businesses. So everyone, this has been another episode for the Warriors Business Podcast. Thanks for listening in. Until next time, y'all be good.
I won't be no left out.